Hi everyone, Steve here, and this is the P word. Thanks for coming back. Now, it's the night before the referendum, the EU referendum, Thursday the 23rd of June tomorrow. Thought I'd try and get in one last video, but it's going to be a big one. My inspiration for this has come from a relative sending me a Facebook post that a business owner, a bouncy castle manufacturer in Leeds, had posted publicly on his Facebook page, making about 13 points and classing them all as fact in the header of his post. Jumping all over that one because that was enough was enough. I'm seeing stuff like this all over the place. The information surrounding all the crap that's gone on over this referendum and the way it's been campaigned about is there. You can find it, the true information behind it that will help you make a decision. So because a lot of the stuff in this post is the kind of thing that people really hear about to do with voting leave or remaining, I'm going to have to use this post and pull it to pieces because some of the stuff in it is just, no, not having it. So I'm going to use it. Hopefully it'll help you. Let's get cracking. Oh, before I start on it though, there's just one thing I want to mention that I've not had a chance to do in any other videos, and I've not done many up to now because I left it too late. Whatever happens with the referendum tomorrow in this country, referendums or the results of them have no legal bearing. EU Parliament is not obliged to enact whatever we decide in law. Parliament in this country is sovereign. It makes and repeals our laws, and it has decided at some point in the past that the results of referendums are not legally binding. So just bear that in mind with all the further that's going on here, that as bad as it would be politically for the government to ignore the result of a referendum, they can choose to do so. It's within their rights as they currently stand. Let's get cracking on this post anyway and try and get you a bit of information that might help make a decision tomorrow. Now, number one on this post: you are not voting to leave the EEA or WTO, meaning all of the UK's trade and benefit agreements will remain unchanged should we leave until such a time that the UK decides to renegotiate them for any reason. This is completely wrong. Let me explain why. The European Economic Area, or EEA, is the area of Europe that falls under the agreement of the EEA, which allows for free movement of goods, services and people. Now, the EEA agreement states that membership of that is open to states that are a member of either the European Union or the European Free Trade Association. So at the minute, we are a member of the European Union. If we vote to leave the EU, we are therefore also voting to leave the EEA. So unless we then negotiate our way into the European Free Trade Association, and this is one of several options the government could consider if that's the way it went, then yes, that's going to go for us. Now, as Article 50 of the Treaty of Lisbon states, and that's the treaty that was last signed, that the EU is operated based on, new agreements with the member that has given notice to leave the EU has to be negotiated and agreed. Now, there's nothing we can do to avoid this, so our trade benefits and agreements will not remain unchanged if we leave the EU. Renegotiation isn't an option, it will happen. Now, the WTO, or World Trade Organization, this is what sets trade tariffs, or the charges that we'd pay on top of the cost of importing and exporting goods to each other as nations, should nations involved not belong to any existing framework or treaty that governs trade rules. If we left the EU and we had no other trade agreements in place, then WTO tariffs would apply to the transactions our businesses carried out with each other across national borders. At the minute, though, it has no bearing whatsoever on our trade benefits as part of the EU because we are part of the EU. It doesn't really kind of like come into this argument at this point, and it would be the last thing that we'd look at trade-wise because we'd be in no other agreement. Now, let's see, next one. Number two, right, you are not voting to leave NATO, meaning our security agreements remain unchanged. Should we receive an act of hostility from a non-NATO member, and NATO countries are obliged to come to our assistance, this does not change. This is correct, but in terms of our membership in the EU, people are talking about it, but it's also a redundant point to focus on that I need to point out. I've seen it a lot. The EU doesn't directly take action when conflict arises. This is why we have NATO and the UN as security organisations based on their own treaties. It's not going to be affected one way or the other. Next one. Sorry, I'm trying to use an Apple Watch here to do this, and whichever way I attempt it, it just doesn't work properly. Don't use Apple gear for these things. As much as I love Apple, they don't always get it right at all. Right, number three. You are not voting to leave the UN, G8 or G20, meaning Britain will have the same voice on the world stage as it does today. This is also correct. However, referring to our place on the world stage through these groups is a bit misleading. As far as the UN Security Council goes, it exists based on treaties among many nations to provide a peacekeeping presence in countries affected by unjustified wars and military aggression. It's been criticised a lot over the years for being quite powerless in reality as well. It has that limited function, as important as that is. I wouldn't really call that world stage, and it also has zero, impact on our economy either, which is one of the biggest things in this. Speaking of economy, and as for the G8, actually that's the G7, because when Russia annexed Crimea in March of 2014, the G8, back as it was then, or the remaining countries of it, voted to suspend Russia's membership, bringing it down from G8 to G7. Now this group is a meeting of the leaders of the most industrialised nations on Earth, in other words the richest. It's got no formal charter, a limited bureaucratic structure, and no permanent secretariat. There were 7 world leaders among many, with little support structure. The idea of our being part of the G7 being compared to our place in the EU with the scale of participation we have in the EU, it's a bit laughable really. Our Prime Minister attending a meeting with 6 other world leaders is not going to decide that much of our future as a nation. The G20, very similar thing, but it's made up of the 20 most industrialised nations in the world. It mainly focuses on economic decision making because it was first formed to deal with the Asian economic crisis of 1999. Again, this in no way can compare to our part in running the EU as a full member. The 3 groups here that were mentioned, they're not comparable to the EU because nothing else like the EU and the scale of it exists. Next up, number 4, let's see. Right, I like this one. You are not voting to leave Europe. The UK will still geographically be part of Europe. Non-political organisations aligned to Europe will still extend membership to the UK, i.e. sports governing bodies and so on. Yes, this is also correct, but if this is in response to fully functioning grown adults saying that we will geographically no longer be part of the continent of Europe, I cannot help you. To think we're going to up sticks the UK and shift it to another part of the planet, or that we're suddenly going to be part of another border structure, I can't dignify that with a response. And if he's thrown into his original post to make a point, it just doesn't really help. Non-political bodies, by virtue of being non-political, have zero bearing on the referendum one way or the other. Although one interesting tidbit I came across earlier today, sports players that are resident in the UK but from other EU countries, they would no longer possess the correct work permits to stay with their British team if we left the EU. Now I don't mean voted to leave, I do mean actually left, but it's one of the things that would need to be sorted out as part of the new agreements made with our European neighbours. Number 5. You are not voting to stop recognising Interpol, Europol, and neither are you voting for SIS/MI6 to stop dealing with other intelligence services in the fight against terrorism and global organised crime. That is true, but that's actually half the story. If you forget Interpol for a second, because that's not really relevant here, it's a larger global scale organisation. Neither is SIS or MI6. Now, they can't operate in a fully transparent fashion in order to do their jobs properly. They need to be clandestine to a degree in order to be successful in the fight against terrorism and various kind of the global kind of plots and things that happen that we, most of the time we never find out in the general public arena. Europol, by comparison, is a police organisation. It therefore it should operate in a fairly transparent way, and it therefore requires a form of criminal justice system to allow it to function. Now, any police force of any kind in a democratic country has a limit to its powers, and they very definitely stop when it comes to the administering of justice. This is where leaving the EU actually would be a problem. Europol on its own doesn't include the joint investigation agreements that our EU membership provides us with. Now, these allow joint forces across the EU borders in different countries in teams of 2 or more to work together on an investigation. That is far more effective than just sharing information with each other. Then we've got an organisation called Eurojust. Now, this is the body responsible for judicial cooperation between member states. You take that away, and the ability to fully try and prosecute criminals from other EU states inside our borders, that would then become a very lengthy and problematic process, and of course it will make it more expensive. Now, not forgetting at the end, there's a database available to EU member states called the European Criminal Records and Information System. This allows EU member states to obtain and hold previous records of previous criminal convictions of EU citizens. This is proven invaluable, according to a notable QC, when it becomes necessary to make a decision on bail in court because the judge has therefore got all the information to hand. It sounds scaremongery, but take that away and how can a court make an effective bail decision on a non-British EU citizen who's been put through our court system? It just doesn't make sense to take it away. Let's have a look. Next up, number 6. Right. You are not voting against being able to travel to Europe, contrary to the belief of some fools recently on TV. Many. The UK has always maintained stricter border and passport controls than many EU members. This will not change. You will still use a passport to go on holiday and you will still be allowed entry to countries in Europe. You may even get a chance to skip queues by using the non-EU queues at the airport. Person does make a point there that that's just an opinion, not necessarily a fact. Roll my eyes at that one. This is mostly true. It will depend on what kind of agreements are formed if we left the EU as to the movement of people. If we stay outside of the trade agreements that I've mentioned previously of the free market, then we will likely need visas to travel to any of those countries, and so will people coming to visit the UK from, the EU or other countries as they do now. Now, this could be no more than a stamp in a passport, but it could go all the way up to having to apply for a pre-travel visa, such as we do if we visit countries like the USA. Now, this would also affect the possibility of skipping queues, of course, but I don't think that's a big enough perk to risk our economy on, so let's just let that one go for now. Next up, number 7. Oh, is my favourite one. The UK economy will benefit to the tune of billions of pounds in the first year after we leave. Now, if you're going to say this and headline your post as full of facts and not back any of it up with any evidence, then you're making yourself a target. And I'm probably going to take a slightly sarcastic tone when I'm going through this one because I just couldn't believe it. If the most prominent economists and economic academic groups in our country cannot agree, in fact, well, not just our country actually, beg your pardon, across Europe, can't agree en masse to the UK economy benefiting from the UK leaving the EU over a number of years, let alone to the scale of how much we would suffer or benefit, what makes this guy able to state this billions of pounds benefit as a fact? The thing with this is the economic studies that are done are based on economic modelling. Economic modelling is far from perfect, and each model that's used for each study uses different sets of assumptions and histories to build a prediction of how things might look in the future based on certain changes. It is a complex process and it runs far above throwaway statements made on blog posts and Facebook posts. And annoyingly, I've seen people take claims like this at face value. You can't say stuff like this and not back it up with evidence. Now, a lot of the studies that have been done, they can't show individually really or agree en masse about how the economy will be affected, but there is a trend in the information they put out, and the trend leads towards a decline in our economy in the short term if we leave the EU. This is something that the Vote Leave campaign themselves have admitted to as well. People like Boris Johnson have actually said it's worth taking the risk. Well, of course, they don't mind taking the risk because Boris Johnson's got a cushy, well-paid job, and if we actually vote to leave the EU, stands them in good stead to keep their cushy jobs because their fans are going to vote them back into office again for getting what they want. They're not the ones who are going to be fighting for jobs if our economy takes a downturn. I'm getting off track here. If the majority of the economic output suggests a downturn in the early stages of us having left the EU, I want to know where he gets his info from saying we'll benefit to the tune of billions in the first year. I haven't seen this anywhere else. I don't even think Vote Leave have tried to claim this one. The biggest point here, none of us can be certain because it's not happened with an economy as big as ours before. Show me the evidence to back up this billions of pounds benefit on this one or be quiet. Next up, number 8. Medical and science research will not simply stop. The UK pays into the EU to then get money back in the form of funding. The UK will now be in control of this money and can choose to fund whatever UK-based medical, science, art or other research it chooses. The first part of this is true. The rest of this statement is riddled with errors. First of all, we pay money into the EU to contribute to its operation. This is no guarantee of getting certain parts of any pots back into the UK, and nor is it something that the UK as a whole gets given. The pots of EU funding exist for specific purposes, and there's a joint arrangement in place between the EU Commission and the Member States to manage the doling out of these funds, but it requires specific projects, organisations and the like to actually apply for the funds. In the case of the UK and research funding from the EU, we actually do disproportionately very well from the last pot of funding that was dished out. We received 15% from that round of funding, and only the Netherlands actually received more than we did. Now, ever since the European Research Council was established in 2007, the UK succeeded in winning over 20% of the funding allocated. That's a fifth as one member state of the funding allocated when that council was set up. And this was also based on excellence in research as well. So there's obviously something well behind what we're doing. However, the disproportion means that the Treasury won't and likely can't afford to budget for the same level of funding to research being carried out in the UK. It's the collaboration of the funding and the running of the research projects together with our mostly EU partners and other international partners that makes it work. It's worth mentioning as well that over 60% of the UK's internationally co-written research papers are with partners inside the EU, 40% outside the EU. Most of this funding and research carried out as well is done by universities, and here we've had 96 vice-chancellors from prominent universities in the country having all co-signed and published an open letter explaining why remaining in the EU is much better for research and higher education. Whatever funding we might be in control of should we leave the EU, it's not going to be anywhere near as much as the money invested now, and working under reduced agreements, we're just not going to have as much say in the research community anymore. Next up, number 9. Right, here's a good one. Farming will not lose money because of EU funding being cut. The UK negotiated a rebate of some monies that the UK pays to the EU in order to subsidise UK farmers. Instead of asking for our money back, we can give it straight to farmers, no change there. Survey says, farming will lose money if we lose the EU. The agriculture industry in the UK currently receives some £1.8 billion a year in direct payments to farmers from EU Common Agricultural Policy payments. I'm not going to go into detail in CAP, as it's called for short, because it's complex and there are criticisms of it that are justifiable to some degree. What is important here is that, again, the Treasury under austerity budgets will find it very, very hard to make up this level of funding to support our farming sector. There's actually more money that goes into agriculture in general, because rural development is something the EU contributes towards. These aren't direct payments, but made on a bigger scale to kind of develop rural areas more. Again, if it's above £1.8 billion, I think totally it looks at about £4.86 billion from what I've read. Where's that coming from? 4.86 billion, the Treasury are not going to find it easy to come with that money. As far as the rebate goes, in terms of the way it was worded, it's the only rebate we get from the money we contribute to the EU, as I mentioned in my last video, about the amount of money we really spend on being in the EU. It's the rebate that Margaret Thatcher obtained on our contributions, and this isn't even given back as such. It's deducted straight from the amount that we're due to pay to Brussels. It never gets over there in the first place. It's got nothing to do with the UK farming sector, and given that we have that rebate anyway and still receive cap payments from the EU, clearly the two things are not related. Now, the farming sector is worried about leaving the EU. As with every spending claim made by the Vote Leave campaign, as far as I'm concerned, they are in no position to guarantee what future budgets in the UK would look like if we left or stayed in the EU. That is down to the Chancellor and the Treasury to work out. So, yes, lots of change there, I'm afraid. Next up, number 10. You are not voting against human rights. The EU Convention on and European Court of Human Rights are not part of the EU. Until Parliament passes a new Bill of Rights for the UK, these will still apply, as will precedents already passed down to UK courts from Brussels. So yes, this is actually true. The European Court of Human Rights and the EU Convention on Human Rights are separate treaties, of which are currently enshrined in UK law. The Human Rights Act of Parliament 1998 incorporates into British domestic law the articles of the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, senior government ministers have in the past year or so hit out at the ECHR and the EU Convention on Human Rights, especially as the referendum's drawn near. And don't let them confuse you into thinking that would change if we left the EU. It's something separate the government would need to withdraw from. The question you really want to be asking here is, do we want the worst Conservative government in modern history, who have repeatedly attacked and undermined the most vulnerable and poor people in our society over the past 6 years, do we want them to be responsible for crafting new laws on human rights for us in the UK? I don't, that is for sure. And the thing about precedents passed down from European courts, well, something is only a precedent until a new one is set. That's the way precedents work. New existing precedents will probably quickly be replaced in our own court system if we lived under a Tory version of human rights, but, you know, again, that's not something we can really predict. Right, up next, number 11. You are not voting to kick anyone out of the UK or block access to anyone, neither are you voting to stop recruiting valuable European workers into things like the NHS. Like my other point about passports for travel, the UK is already outside of the Schengen zone, and so migrant workers must enter the UK with a valid passport before and after June the 23rd. That will not change. British borders maintain full control of who comes and goes. Should someone have the skills to apply to work in the NHS, then they will still be permitted travel and given an opportunity to apply for a job. As for sovereignty, well, I said I'd come back to it. In the UK, again, we live in what's called a parliamentary sovereignty. That means our parliament is sovereign. So none of this about we're not handing sovereignty to David Cameron and it goes to the House. Yes, that is how it works in this country, regardless of how we vote. The Parliament is sovereign. It makes and repeals our laws. It's not very good at the last one, but that's what it does. Part of being in something like the EU, though, it means to give up some of your sovereignty in order to let the greater collaborative organisation make decisions on those areas of life. I've yet to be convinced by anyone that the small amount of sovereignty that we've given over to the EU should come back to us. It's a small amount as well. If you look at the argument the Brexiteers make all the time that 75% of EU British law is dictated by the EU, the numbers that make that up don't support that. Between 1993 and 2014, UK Parliament passed 945 acts of law, and this is available to look at in the House of Commons Library. 231 of those acts implemented EU obligations of some sort. Now, obligations are the mandates passed down from the EU Commission should the EU Parliament vote to accept them. Over the same period of time, UK Parliament also passed 33,160 statutory instruments. This is secondary legislation, and interestingly comes from a somewhat undemocratic part of our government because instruments are enacted into law without being scrutinised by Parliament first. Now, 4,283 of those instruments implemented EU obligations. If you add both of those figures together and divide it by the whole number of UK laws passed, you get the figure of 13%. So actually 13% of our laws passed which implemented EU law, not 75%. Where did the 75% figure come from? Well, this Brexit figure includes some rules and regulations set out by the EU that don't apply to us in the UK because of our special status, and that is things like rules regarding the euro. You know, we're not part of the single currency, nor will we ever be. Then you've got rules governing the Schengen area. Again, we're not part of that, so it doesn't apply to us. And there's an awful lot of those regulations that are passed down. So they're adding everything up together there and saying 75%. It's very misleading. Now, as for the very last comment about thinking of yours and your family's future, leaving the EU is going to make that, if nothing, very unpredictable. I am not telling anyone how to vote, through all these videos. My personal feelings after a lot of reading behind the claims made by both Leave and Remain is that in some way we'll suffer as a nation, certainly economically. A lot of these style posts and opinions come down to the I'm alright Jack way of thinking. Unfortunately, this is not about one single person or family, it's about all of us as a nation. It's about safeguarding our entire nation's economy and its future. Handing it over lock, stock and barrel to a right-wing, austerity-hungry government with no oversight to protect us from how they would like to shape our economy, that is what will favour the rich and elite. Just look at the figures that are telling you to vote to leave the European Union. Boris Johnson, he is in this to be Prime Minister. That is his chief ambition, and it's been well documented in the press. Nigel Farage, the middle-class establishment wolf in working-class sheep's clothing, who's been stoking the fires of immigration hatred and constantly lies about protecting the NHS. Well, he's been quoted as wanting to see it privatised, despite also saying the opposite as well. And Michael Gove, God, the most despised education secretary for a generation who became so toxic in his job, in the end, David Cameron had to shuffle him out into something else. And who also, let's not forget, ushered in large-scale privatisation into our schools through the academies system. Privatisation in schools. When these people are telling you what we should do in terms of voting to leave or stay in the European Union, good sense surely should tell you to question their motives instead of just taking it as read. So that's everything in that post pulled apart, and I hope it's given you some pertinent information that's going to help you to decide which way to vote tomorrow, and please do go out there and vote. If you think anyone else will benefit from this, pass it around social media. We've only got a few hours left till people are going to bed, or could have time to watch it in the morning before they go and cast a vote. Leave me some comments and suggestions below if you want to. But otherwise, please get out there and vote, and I'll catch you next time. Worst case, points-based assessment like the US, Canada and Australia use will come into effect. The UK is likely to negotiate freedom of labour movement, though, in exchange for freedom of goods movement. Now, this is largely true, and in case in point though, the NHS would actually collapse if we suddenly stopped employing people who were born in other countries. It's the largest employer in the UK collectively, and it's propped up in large numbers by migrant workers. This is a good thing as far as I'm concerned. That being said, and as I pointed out at the beginning of this, if the result on 23rd of June is to leave, that is nothing more than us telling the government what we want. Nothing will change for a while. Changes like this take time. Free movement of goods, services and people will continue for at least a 2-year period of our notice to leave the European Union. Things, of course, then would change once we've actually withdrawn and operating under a new set of treaties. And the last point he made there was also interesting because it kind of undermines his first incorrect point that I went over. It's a possibility, yes, that we would negotiate for Norwegian-style access to the open market, but this requires us to agree to the free movement of EU citizens to work and live across our borders. It's not something you actually negotiate for. If you want access to the open market, you have to agree to that, simple as. If anyone in the UK thinks that somehow we could negotiate otherwise, then you seriously overestimate how much the European Parliament would support us in that, because it would never happen. Next up, number 12. You are not voting to move jobs nor production out of the UK. The EU actually helps fund the move of Ford Transit production from the UK to Turkey. Yes, the EU helped give UK jobs to people in Turkey by giving Ford a loan of £80 million with very generous terms. Now, this is actually true as far as I can find in my research. The European Central Bank, of which we part own, and George Osborne, interestingly, is one of the governors, lent Ford £80 million on generous terms, including a 2-year grace period, and this was to finalise moving production of the transit van from Southampton over to Turkey. Most transits were already being made in Turkey by this point anyway, and Ford had already had a £10 million loan from the EU previously for the Southampton plant, but it clearly wasn't enough to save it. So the closure saw the loss of about 350 jobs. Now, having said that, of all the moves of companies and manufacturing the UK have lost in recent years, that's the only one the EU has helped to fund. So, all others which you can read about from the link in item 12, and there's been quite a few, it's in the description below, they're not because of EU membership, nor anything to do with EU governance. As is often the case, it is about the company saving money, about boosting share value, or in the case of Boots, just plain out tax avoidance. Up next, number 13. Right, this is the final one. It's a doozy, so bear with me. What you are voting for is UK sovereignty. You are voting to stay in or leave a political union of leaders and representatives that you British people did not elect. You are voting against a commission of unelected elite men that nobody at all voted for, and yet they make decisions on our behalf. You are simply voting to bring sovereignty back to Westminster, and that is all. If you worry about that because you don't like the Conservative government, look at the reality. Their majority in Parliament is very slim. They have been blocked on big decisions already. You are therefore not giving sovereignty to David Cameron, but to the UK House of Elected Representatives. Do not be fooled by the fear campaigns that are simply run by the wealthy, who need EU money to thrive. Think about the future and your family's future. And here we are again. UK sovereignty. Kind of getting tired of seeing this, but I'll come back to that in a second. If any of you have watched my video on the EU government, I explained that its structure, in many ways, it's more democratic than the UK government. Phrases like House of Lords and unelected head of state spring to mind, for one thing. By comparison, the members of the EU Parliament are elected into office by citizens of the EU. Now, they in turn vote the President of the EU Commission into office, who's recommended by the members of the EU Council. The EU Council are the democratically elected ministers of the scratch that. The EU Council is made up of senior government ministers or heads of state across the EU from democratically elected governments, and the EU Parliament also vote into office the College of 28 commissioners, again, who will put forward as recommendations. Clearly the choice of wording in the original point is not a bit poor really, because lots of electing goes on to put the EU government into place every 5 years. So, as for sovereignty, well, I said I'd come back to it. In the UK, again, we live in what's called a parliamentary sovereignty. That means our parliament is sovereign. So none of this about we're not handing sovereignty to David Cameron and it goes to the House. Yes, that is how it works in this country, regardless of how we vote. The parliament is sovereign. It makes and repeals our laws. It's not very good at the last one, but that's what it does. Part of being in something like the EU, though, it means to give up some of your sovereignty in order to let the greater collaborative organisation make decisions on those areas of life. I've yet to be convinced by anyone that the small amount of sovereignty that we've given over to the EU should come back to us. It's a small amount as well. If you look at the argument the Brexiteers make all the time that 75% of the British law is dictated by the EU, The numbers that make that up don't support that. Between 1993 and 2014, UK Parliament passed 945 acts of law, and this is available to look at in the House of Commons library. 231 of those acts implemented EU obligations of some sort. Now, obligations are the mandates passed down from the EU Commission should the EU Parliament vote to accept them. Over the same period of time, UK Parliament also passed 33,160 statutory instruments. This is secondary legislation, and interestingly comes from a somewhat undemocratic part of our government, because instruments are enacted into law without being scrutinised by Parliament first. Now, 4,283 of those instruments implemented EU obligations. If you add both of those figures together, then divide it by the whole number of UK laws passed, you get the figure of 13%. So actually, 13% of our laws passed which implemented EU law, not 75%. Where did the 75% figure come from? Well, this Brexit figure includes some rules and regulations set out by the EU that don't apply to us in the UK because of our special status, and that is things like rules regarding the euro. We're not part of the single currency, nor will we ever be. Then you've got rules governing the Schengen area. Again, we're not part of that, so it doesn't apply to us. And there's an awful lot of those regulations that are passed down. So they're adding everything up together there and saying 75%. It's very misleading. Now, as for the very last comment about thinking of yours and your family's future, leaving the EU is going to make that, if nothing, very unpredictable. I am not telling anyone how to vote, through all these videos. My personal feelings after a lot of reading behind the claims made by both Leave and Remain is that in some way we'll suffer as a nation, certainly economically. A lot of these style posts and opinions come down to the I'm alright Jack way of thinking. Unfortunately, this is not about one single person or family, it's about all of us as a nation. It's about safeguarding our entire nation's economy and its future. Handing it over lock, stock and barrel to a right-wing, austerity-hungry government with no oversight to protect us from how they would like to shape our economy, that is what will favour the rich and elite. Just look at the figures that are telling you to vote to leave the European Union. Boris Johnson, he is in this to be Prime Minister. That is his chief ambition, and it's been well documented in the press. Nigel Farage, the middle-class establishment wolf in working-class sheep's clothing, who's been stoking the fires of immigration hatred and constantly lies about protecting the NHS. Well, he's been quoted as wanting to see it privatised, despite also saying the opposite as well. And Michael Gove, God, the most despised education secretary for a generation, who became so toxic in his job, in the end, David Cameron had to shuffle him out into something else. And who also, let's not forget, ushered in large-scale privatisation into our schools through the academies system. Privatisation in schools. When these people are telling you what we should do in terms of voting to leave or stay in the European Union, good sense surely should tell you to question their motives instead of just taking it as read. So that's everything in that post pulled apart, and I hope it's given you some pertinent information that's going to help you to decide which way to vote tomorrow, and please do go out there and vote. If you think anyone else will benefit from this, pass it around social media. We've only got a few hours left till people are going to bed, or could have time to watch it in the morning before they go and cast a vote. Leave me some comments and suggestions below if you want to. But otherwise, please get out there and vote, and I'll catch you next time.